Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when the human brain, despite all its elegance and complexity, simply cannot find language fast enough to match the intensity of what the heart is experiencing. And even though I spend my days thinking about cognition, neural pathways, emotional encoding, and the silent architecture of consciousness, nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the phenomenon I am about to describe to you tonight. Some people think love is irrational. Some think it is biochemical chaos. Others imagine it as some poetic force carried by metaphors and moonlight. But if you look closely, truly closely, what you find is that love is one of the most advanced neurological synchronizations the human species is capable of achieving. And that understanding became clear to me on the day I found myself asking a woman the question that changed the entire trajectory of my life. Will you marry me? Now, I want to take you back to that moment, not because the question itself is uncommon, but because the meaning behind it was built on years of internal discoveries, cognitive recalibrations, failures, recoveries, and emotional awakenings. You see, the proposal itself was just the final 5 seconds of a journey that had been shaping itself inside my orbit long before I had the courage to articulate it. Before we reach that moment, I want to take you deeper into the part of human experience that we often ignore: the hidden signals, the emotional physics, the subtle psychological evolutions that make us who we are when we choose someone not just as a partner, but as a forever ally in the mission of life. I've spent years studying human potential, not just the obvious markers like intelligence, creativity, resilience, but the invisible ones: authenticity, emotional intelligence, neural harmony, attachment calibration. One thing I learned early is that the brain can adapt to nearly anything except loneliness. Chronic emotional isolation is as damaging to the nervous system as starvation is to the body. Humans weren't built to walk alone. Not biologically, not psychologically, not spiritually. And yet, for a long time, I tried. I tried to outrun the need for emotional closeness by burying myself in work that demanded every synapse of attention. I convinced myself that the world needed more innovation, more breakthroughs, more progress, and that personal life could wait. But neuroscience has a way of humbling even the most stubborn mind. Because every study, every scan, every dataset whispered the same truth: connection is not optional. It is not a luxury. It is the operating system of the human experience. Still, understanding a truth intellectually does not guarantee that we embrace it emotionally. I knew the science. I lectured about it. I repeated it. But I didn't live it. Not until the day she entered my life. I remember the first conversation, not because it was dramatic or cinematic, but because it felt strangely familiar, as if some part of my neural circuitry that had been dormant suddenly reactivated. You know that feeling when you meet someone and your brain begins mapping them instantly, not in a calculating way, but in a deeply intuitive one. There's a scientific name for this: rapid affective imprinting. It happens when the brain encounters someone who matches patterns of emotional safety, intellectual resonance, or long-buried ideals. For most people, it lasts a few seconds. For me, it didn't fade. Every time we spoke, my thoughts rearranged themselves, not in the chaotic way people romanticize, but in a profoundly clarifying way. She didn't disrupt my life. She refined it. It was as if the noise in my head quieted, and suddenly, I could hear the signal more clearly than ever. There is a misconception in the world that love is irrational. I disagree. The wrong partnerships are irrational. The right ones are the most rational decision-making process the brain is capable of. When you meet someone who expands your mental framework, calms your nervous system, stabilizes your emotional bandwidth, and elevates your highest potential, your entire biology begins to align around that person. And that alignment terrified me at first, because the more I understood what she meant to me, the more I realized I wasn't just choosing a relationship. I was choosing a future that I couldn't predict, couldn't simulate, couldn't turn into an equation or a model. For someone who lives in a world of logic and precision, that level of uncertainty was intimidating. But then something extraordinary happened. She didn't try to change me. She didn't try to impress me. She didn't try to fit into any blueprint of what a perfect partner should look like. She simply existed as herself, fully, honestly, and without performance. And that simplicity was the most disarming thing I had ever encountered. Humans often talk about being seen, but what they truly crave is being understood. Being seen is visual. Being understood is psychological. When someone understands you, your contradictions, your fears, your ambitions, your flaws, and they don't flinch, something fundamentally shifts inside you. That shift happened the day she looked at me and said, "You don't always have to be strong." It was such a simple sentence. 6 words, but those 6 words rewired me, because strength had always been my default setting. Leadership requires strength. Innovation requires strength. Resilience requires strength. But intimacy, real intimacy, requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is a form of courage that no achievement can replace. I didn't propose to her because I needed someone. I proposed because I finally understood what it feels like when you find someone who stands beside you, not behind you, not in front of you, but beside you shoulder to shoulder, in every storm and every sunrise. The human brain is designed to bond with someone who helps it feel safe enough to grow. That's what she did for me. She didn't just enter my life, she expanded it. She didn't fill a void, she illuminated it. She didn't stabilize my world, she made it more meaningful. Which brings me to the moment I finally asked her the question. I had rehearsed it 1,000 times in my mind, each version overly structured, overly prepared, too engineered to feel real. But life has a way of laughing at your scripts, because when the moment came, none of the rehearsed lines survived. What actually happened was far simpler and far more human. We were talking about something ordinary, something trivial, something everyday, and somewhere between one sentence and the next I felt it. That surge of clarity, that alignment of mind and heart that neuroscience calls limbic coherence. It's the exact moment the emotional and rational centers of the brain agree on a decision. A moment of total certainty. I looked at her. She looked back. And I asked the question not as a scientist, not as a thinker, not as a man trying to script perfection, but simply as a human being finally aligned with his truth. "Future wife, will you marry me?" She didn't gasp. She didn't freeze. She didn't burst into tears like a scene written for a romantic film. Instead, she did something that struck me deeper than any dramatic reaction could have. She smiled, not a wide, sudden, cinematic smile, but a slow, warm, deeply knowing one. The kind that forms when someone understands the magnitude of what you're saying long before the words even reach them. Then she stepped closer, placed her hand gently against my chest, right over the heartbeat I was trying to control, and said the words that disarmed me completely. "I already chose you." It wasn't even a yes. It was something far more powerful than yes. A yes is a response, a choice is a declaration. Her words rewired the moment, turning what I thought was a beginning into something she had already decided in the quiet space of her own heart. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt my mind go silent. No analysis, no internal calculations, no predictions, just silence. The kind of silence that happens when certainty finally replaces doubt. If you've ever experienced that kind of silence, you know it's not empty, it's full. It's the rare moment when the mind stops anticipating the future, because it has arrived at a truth big enough to fill every available space. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what she had just said, but she knew. She knew exactly what those words were doing to me. The human brain has thousands of micro-expressions, subtle cues that reveal what we're thinking long before a word ever leaves our mouths. She had learned to read mine effortlessly. And in that moment, she knew she had reached the deepest place inside me, the one I rarely let anyone enter. Neuroscience teaches us that emotional safety is not created by grand gestures. It's created by consistent signals. Thousands of small moments that tell your nervous system, you are safe here. You are seen here. You are valued here. What she offered me in that moment was the culmination of all those signals. But what really shook me was what she said next. "I didn't fall in love with your strength," she whispered. "I fell in love with the parts you thought you needed to hide." When she said that, something inside me shifted so profoundly that I could almost feel my emotional architecture reorganizing itself. Because isn't that what all of us secretly hope for? To be loved not just for what is impressive about us, but for what is imperfect. To be accepted not just for the version we present to the world, but for the version we only reveal in the quiet, unguarded corners of our lives. I realized then that she had seen me clearly from the beginning and loved me not despite my flaws, but alongside them. And that realization carried more weight than any yes ever could. You see, marriage is not just a partnership, it's a kind of cognitive merging, a long-term synchronization of values, rhythms, vulnerabilities, and dreams. When two people choose each other, they're not just making a personal decision, they're making a neurological one. Their emotional systems begin to adapt to each other, attuning in ways that shape the very fabric of their lives. Her choice, the fact that she had already chosen me, told me something I had never fully grasped. Love is not something you chase. Love is something you recognize. It arrives quietly, settles deeply, and reveals itself slowly, not through fireworks, but through alignment. Not through intensity, but through presence. And in that moment, holding her hand and trying to keep my voice steady, I understood the real meaning of companionship: two people who commit, not only to walking together, but to evolving together. Growth becomes a shared mission. Vulnerability becomes a shared language. And life, with all its unpredictability, becomes a shared frontier. Her answer didn't just humble me, it redefined me. Because for someone like me, someone accustomed to building worlds, solving problems, creating systems, and navigating complexity, realizing that the most important breakthrough of my life came not from invention, but from connection, that was a kind of revelation I never anticipated. I once believed the greatest achievements in life would come from mastery, mastering technology, mastering knowledge, mastering the unknown. But she taught me something far more profound. Sometimes the greatest achievement is simply allowing yourself to be loved. The days that followed the proposal were unlike anything I had experienced before. Not because everything changed, but because nothing had to. We didn't suddenly become different people. The world didn't feel altered. Instead, it felt clarified, it felt aligned. It's like when you adjust the lens on a telescope. The stars were always there, but now you see them with a resolution you didn't know was possible. She didn't just say yes. She allowed me to see myself more clearly. And that is perhaps the most powerful effect one human being can have on another. As we continued forward, planning, dreaming, imagining, I found myself reflecting on something I had once read in a study on long-term bonding. It said that the highest form of emotional intimacy is not built on agreement, but on understanding. Meaning you don't have to think the same. You just have to think together. You don't have to want identical futures, only futures that can coexist. That is what I found with her. Not a mirror of myself. That would be emotionally uninteresting. Not an opposite. That would be exhausting. But a complement. The rare configuration that elevates both people without diminishing either. And as I stood with her, days after she spoke those unforgettable words, I understood something that took me years of study. To finally feel the human brain is at its best not when it works alone, but when it works in harmony with another. Cooperation is evolutionary. Partnership is neurological. Love at its core is biological courage. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something extraordinary happening inside me. Something I hadn't planned for. Something I couldn't have engineered. Something no algorithm could quantify. My sense of time began to change. You see, when you live a life driven by goals, deadlines, missions, and constant forward momentum, time becomes compressed. You live ahead of yourself. You think in trajectories, not in moments. But with her, moments expanded. A 10-minute conversation felt like an hour of clarity. A quiet walk felt like a deep reset of the mind. Her laughter felt like a neural anchor, stabilizing, grounding, reorienting me toward what actually matters. Neuroscientifically, this phenomenon has a name: temporal dilation under emotional regulation. When your nervous system feels safe, it stops rushing. When your heart feels aligned, it stops searching. And when your mind feels understood, it stops running. She was the first person who ever slowed down my internal world without asking me to stop my external one. And that, to me, was revolutionary. Sometimes we underestimate the power of one person to change the way our brain experiences reality. We think transformation has to be dramatic or disruptive, but often it's the opposite. Real transformation is subtle, quiet, gentle. It happens in those tiny neurological recalibrations, the ones that soften you, steady you, and open parts of your heart you didn't realize had been locked. One evening, not long after the proposal, I found her sitting near a window, reading. It was an ordinary scene, nothing spectacular, nothing staged. But the way the light fell across her face, the way her eyes moved across the page, the way she breathed, there was something profoundly grounding about it. I sat beside her and watched her for a moment. She noticed, smiled slightly, and asked, "What?" And for the first time, I said something that had been emerging inside me ever since she spoke those unforgettable words. "You make life feel humane." Because that's what she did. She brought humanity into the spaces where ambition had once crowded it out. She brought warmth into the corners I had neglected. She brought softness into a world that had often required me to be hard. People talk about love as though it's an escape. But she wasn't an escape from my life. She became the dimension that completed it. She wasn't a distraction from my mission. She became the gravity that kept me centered within it. And she wasn't a chapter in my story. She was the axis around which the rest of my life began to rotate with clearer intention. The deeper our conversations grew, the more I began to understand something I had overlooked for years. Love is not the opposite of logic. Love is a higher form of logic, one that incorporates emotional intelligence, intuitive understanding, long-term vision, and the courage to build something that will outlast both people. In many ways, committing to someone is the most futuristic decision you can make. It is a promise to co-navigate uncertainties, to co-construct meaning, to co-author a life that neither of you could create alone. That realization struck me again the night we talked about the future. She asked me what I wanted most, not in the grand, planetary sense, not in the technological sense, but in the deeply human sense. It took me several seconds to answer, which is unusual for someone who usually lives 5 thoughts ahead. But I finally said, "I want a life that feels true." She nodded, as if she had known that long before I said it. Then she told me something I will never forget. Truth isn't found in perfection, it's found in presence. A presence. Such a simple word, such an underestimated force. Presence is the bridge between two people. It is the antidote to emotional distance. It is the quiet proof that you value not what someone does, but who they are. That word reshaped the way I approached everything. And she didn't just talk about presence, she lived it. She had a way of listening with her whole being, not just her ears. A way of touching your hand that said, "I'm here." A way of speaking that didn't just fill silence but illuminated it. It was then I realized that love, real love, is not found in intensity, but in consistency. It's not the dramatic peaks, but the reliable rhythms, the daily respect, the honest conversations, the shared values, the quiet devotion. The small, steady promises kept without fanfare. She embodied all of that with a kind of effortless grace. And the more I understood her, the more I understood myself, not as the world sees me, but as a human being with hopes, fears, insecurities, and dreams that don't fit into any equation or blueprint. She didn't simplify me. She completed me in the only way completion ever works, not by filling a void, but by amplifying what was already true. The day she said, "I already chose you," she wasn't just saying yes to a question. She was saying yes to my past, my complexity, my imperfections, my vision. and my humanity. And in return, I wasn't just choosing a partner, I was choosing a truth that finally aligned every part of my life. As the wedding day approaches, I find myself thinking less about the ceremony and more about the life that will follow it. The shared mornings, the long conversations, the adventures, the challenges, the moments of uncertainty that will test us, the victories that will define us, the growth that will transform us. Marriage isn't a destination, it's a mission, a lifelong collaboration between two minds, two hearts, two histories, two futures converging into one evolving story. And I feel more ready than ever for that mission, because she has already given me the rarest gift one human can offer another, the feeling of being fully understood. Tonight, as I stand here sharing this with you, I'm reminded of one simple truth that neuroscience, psychology, and life itself have taught me over and over. The greatest decisions are not made by the mind alone or the heart alone, but when both speak the same language. On the day I asked her to marry me, that alignment finally happened. Mind, heart, logic, emotion, all of them pointing in the same direction, toward her. So when I think about the future now, I don't see uncertainty. I see possibility. I see partnership. I see a horizon wide enough for two. And I see a woman who looked at me with quiet confidence and said the words that will echo in my mind for the rest of my life. I already chose you. Those 4 words are the reason I stand here, not just hopeful but whole. And if there is one message I leave you with tonight, it is this: find the person who doesn't just answer your question. Find the person who becomes your answer. Because when you find that person, you will understand what I finally understand now. The future is not built alone. The heart is not meant to travel without a companion. And love, real love, is the most extraordinary journey a human being can take. Thank you.